the night descends quietly. Somewhere outside, the rain has begun. It falls without hurry, without any need to arrive anywhere in particular. It simply falls, the way old things return to the earth, gently, without complaint, without insisting on being noticed. And in this quiet, let us travel together. Let us move back through the centuries, through the long corridors of Japan's past, to find a man who spent his life doing what the rain does naturally, moving through the world without grasping, without needing to stay anywhere too long, leaving behind something luminous and lasting in every place he passed through. His name was Matsuo Bashō, and before we say anything more about him, let us pause here for just a moment, because there is something about this man that most people, even those who grew up in Japan, who studied his poems in school, who can recite his most famous haiku from memory without really trying, do not know. Or rather, something they know without truly feeling the weight of. Matsuo Bashō, the man celebrated as Japan's greatest haiku master, the wandering poet of solitude and moss and frog ponds and the old silent world, was, for much of his early life, a samurai's personal attendant. He lived inside a castle compound. He wore formal hakama. He learned the etiquette of the warrior class, the precise protocols of service and deference. The quiet hermit of Japanese poetry began his story in a world of hierarchy and duty, and the strict codes that governed every movement of a person's body and every word of their speech. Let that sit with you for a moment, as the rain settles outside. There's a kind of comfort in it, perhaps. The idea that the most profound expressions of stillness and simplicity in Japanese literary history came not from someone born into ease and contemplation, but from someone who had to find his way toward those things, step by difficult step, across the difficult terrain of an actual human life. He was born in 1644 in the province of Aiga, a mountainous, slightly remote region in what is now Mie Prefecture, west of the great city of Nara, east of the Kii Peninsula, with its ancient forests and pilgrimage routes. Iga is a name that carries its own particular resonance in Japanese history, because this province would later become famous, in legend, and eventually in popular culture worldwide, for something entirely different from poetry: the ninja. The mountain communities of Iga were long associated with a tradition of stealth, of moving quietly through the world without leaving traces, of the disciplined art of not being seen. Whether any of this seeped into the young Basho's soul, we cannot say with confidence, but there is something fitting about it, isn't there? That a man who would one day teach the world how to disappear into a single moment, how to vanish into 17 syllables and leave nothing behind but the echo of something true, was born in a land that had long celebrated the art of disappearing altogether. The countryside of Iga was beautiful in the way that mountainous Japanese provinces tend to be beautiful. Layered and green and slightly closed in, the valleys narrow and the light falling at particular angles through the cedar forests, the rivers cold and clear and full of sound. It was the kind of landscape that teaches you, without intending to pay attention to small things. The way the mist sits in the lower parts of a valley at dawn. The sound a particular stream makes when the water level changes after rain. The color of a mountain in late afternoon when the light is at a low angle and everything seems to be lit slightly from within. There is no evidence that Bashō wrote about his childhood landscape directly. But you can feel it in his poems, the patience with which he attends to the natural world, the unsentimental precision with which he observes the behavior of seasons and weather and living things. His childhood name was Kinsaku, and later he was known as Munefusa. The family was of farming stock, though the exact details of their social standing are somewhat uncertain. Historians suggest his father may have had some low-ranking samurai connections, which would explain what happened next. What is known is that as a young teenager, perhaps around 13 or 14 years old, Bashō entered the service of a local samurai lord named Todo Yoshitada. He became a companion and attendant to this lord's son, a young man close to his own age, whose poetic name was Sengin. And here is where the poetry entered, because Sengin loved haiku. He was deeply, genuinely enthusiastic about the form. The compressed, crystalline verse that had been developing in Japan for generations. Rooted in the older tradition of renga, the collaborative linked verse in which poets would build chains of image and feeling together, each stanza responding to the one before. Haiku in Bashō's time was still finding its mature form, still being shaped and argued over and practiced and experimented with by a whole generation of poets across the country. In the company of this young lord, Bashō began to write. He began to study the older masters, to listen, to practice the particular discipline of saying the most in the fewest words. The two young men, master and servant, and yet also something closer than that, something genuinely like friendship across the lines of class, composed poems together, learned together, shared the quiet pleasure of trying to press an entire season, an entire feeling, an entire landscape into 17 syllables. Let us imagine them on an evening like this one. The candles are lit. The rain perhaps falling outside a shoji screen, that soft diffusion of candlelight through translucent paper that turns the whole room into something gentle and slightly dreamlike, as though the edges of things have been allowed to soften. Sengin reads a poem aloud, slowly, giving each syllable its proper weight. Bashō listens. Then he picks up his brush, feels the cold smoothness of the inkstone beneath his fingers, and he writes something in response. Not yet great, not yet Bashō, but already looking for something that cannot quite be named, already reaching past the surface of things toward whatever lies just below. Then, when Bashō was around 22 or 23 years old, Sengin died unexpectedly. He was young. The records do not tell us exactly what took him, only that he was suddenly and irreversibly gone. And with his death, something shifted in Bashō's life, quietly and entirely. The structure he had lived within, the household, the hierarchy, the role and the identity of a loyal attendant, no longer held the same meaning. According to some accounts, the Todo family, recognizing Bashō's abilities and loyalty, offered him a permanent and comfortable position. They valued him. He could have stayed. He could have built a life in the familiar compound, under the protection of a powerful family, with security and belonging, and all the ordinary satisfactions of a settled life. He didn't stay. Instead, he left for Kyoto. He was a young man with a real gift for poetry, a heart still carrying the weight of an unexpected loss, and no particular fixed destination. He went to study, to learn, to move through the city's rich cultural world and find his place within it. Kyoto in the late 17th century was still the imperial capital in a ceremonial sense, still the center of Japanese classical culture, still home to the great temples and academies and literary circles, that had been accumulating beauty and wisdom for centuries. In Kyoto, Bashō deepened his knowledge of haiku under teachers who worked in the established school of the day. He read widely and hungrily. He absorbed the classical literature of Japan, the great poetry anthologies like the Manyoshu and the Kokinshu, the elegant prose of Sei Shonagon's Pillow Book, the long, melancholy beauty of the tale of Genji with its season-soaked atmosphere and its deep attention to the way things pass. He was forming himself, slowly, the way a river forms a canyon. Not by force, but by patient return, day after day, year after year, wearing something open. By the time he arrived in Edo, the city that would eventually become Tokyo, sometime around 1672, he was in his late 20s and already a working poet with some reputation. Edo was a booming, energetic city, the seat of the Tokugawa shogunate, and the administrative center of a country that had, after centuries of war, settled into an unusual and productive peace. It was a city of commerce and ambition, of craftsmen and merchants and samurai and servants and poets and theater people and fishermen and noodle vendors and everyone else who had been drawn from the provinces by the gravitational pull of a city that was growing faster than anyone could quite keep up with. It was not a quiet place, and yet Bashō made a life there. He taught poetry. He gathered students. He participated in the competitive haiku world of the city, where poems were composed in rapid sequence at gatherings, judged and ranked by acknowledged masters, discussed with a seriousness and passion that might surprise those who think of poetry as a quiet and marginal art. Slowly, through the 1670s, his reputation grew. His poems were circulated and admired. His teaching attracted devoted students. And then, in 1680, something happened that tells us a great deal about who Bashō was becoming. His students, wishing to honor their teacher in a concrete and affectionate way, built him a small hut on the outskirts of the city, near the Sumida River, in a neighborhood that was then still somewhat rural, a place where the city thinned into gardens and fields and the sound of the river was audible at night. It was a humble place, really just a simple wooden dwelling, spare and undecorated. But one of his students planted something in the small garden beside it. A banana tree. In Japanese, the banana tree is called Bashō, and from that tree, the poet took the name that would define him for the rest of his life and for all the centuries to come. He became Bashō, the banana tree. It is a name that carries its own quiet philosophy. The banana plant is something of an anomaly in the Japanese climate. It looks strong and tropical and slightly out of place, and its broad, graceful leaves are easily torn by the wind. It cannot survive a hard winter without protection. For all its apparent lushness, it is fragile. There is a passage in Bashō's own writing where he reflects on his name, and he describes the banana tree as beautiful in a way that is also somehow insufficient, broad-leafed and useless and easily damaged, and yet persistent, continuing to grow, continuing to offer its particular kind of beauty without being asked. It is a very honest name for a man who was learning to be honest about the nature of things. He lived in this banana tree hut through several winters, and it was here that some of his most important early mature work was composed. There was also, during this period, a chapter of his life that tends to surprise even devoted students of his work. Bashō was appointed the official supervisor of a significant urban waterworks project for the city of Edo. He was not simply a poet meditating on the nature of existence. He had administrative responsibilities. He corresponded with officials. He managed practical logistics. He oversaw the work of laborers. The great future master of wabi and sabi, of poverty embraced as a spiritual practice, of simplicity as a path to truth, spent several years of his middle life as something very close to a municipal project manager, dealing with the thoroughly unromantic problems of water supply and drainage in a rapidly growing city. Let that detail rest gently in the room with you for a moment. Life is rarely made of one pure thing, and the life of a great artist least of all. The path toward simplicity is almost never simple. And Bashō, who would eventually strip his poetry down to the barest essentials, had to pass through the world of civic administration and professional reputation before he could find his way to the narrow road. It was during these years in the banana tree hut, amid the teaching and the city business, and the social demands of a successful career, that his philosophy of poetry began to deepen into something genuinely new. The haiku tradition he had inherited was largely playful and witty, a kind of refined verbal game where the pleasure lay in surprising juxtapositions, in the elegant, unexpected twist at the end of 17 syllables, in demonstrating ingenuity and classical learning. The best poems were clever. They rewarded close reading and showed off their maker's skill. Bashō had written plenty of these poems, and he was good at them. But he was growing dissatisfied with cleverness. He was reaching for something quieter and more difficult to name, something that could hold the actual weight of a real moment without turning it into a demonstration of skill, something that could be present, the way a stone is present on the bottom of a clear stream, without asking for attention, without performing. He called this quality makoto, which can be translated as sincerity or truthfulness or authenticity. A poem, for Bashō, should not be a performance. It should not try to be beautiful. It should simply observe, accurately and completely, without arrangement. It should be what the moment is, not what the poet thinks would make a good poem. He also developed what he articulated as the concept of fueki ryuko, literally the unchanging and the ever-changing. Any true poem must hold both of these simultaneously: the unchanging, universal nature of human experience across time and culture, and the specific, irreplaceable, absolutely unrepeatable particularity of this exact moment. This season, this pond, this frog on this specific afternoon, the great and the small, the eternal and the ephemeral, held together in the same breath without comment, without explanation, without the poet's hand reaching into point and say, "Look, this is significant. This is harder than it sounds." Most of us, when we try to describe a moment of experience, end up either abstracting it into something universal, and therefore slightly vague and impersonal, or pinning it so specifically to one place and time that no one who was not there can really enter it. Bashō spent his life learning to do neither, to find the exact point where the universal breathes through the specific without suffocating it, where the small particular thing opens like a door into something much larger and older and more persistent. And then, in his late 30s, as his reputation reached its comfortable peak, he seems to have entered a period of genuine spiritual crisis. By around 1682 or 1683, Bashō had become famous and established. His school was successful and well attended. His students were devoted and talented. He had a certain comfort, a certain security, a certain settled place in the social world of Edo poetry. And he found that none of it felt sufficient. Something in him was restless and dissatisfied in a way that more success or more study could not resolve. According to his own writings from this period, he suffered from both physical illness and from a deep spiritual unease, a kind of hollow feeling that had settled into his chest. He described feeling as though he were neither fully in the world of ordinary people nor fully outside it, hovering somewhere between the two, unable to commit to either direction. There is a passage in his writing from around this time where he describes himself in terms that are quietly devastating in their honesty. He says he is like a sick man who has lost his appetite. Nothing satisfies, and the very foods he used to enjoy have begun to taste like nothing. The very thing that had given his days their shape and meaning had begun to feel hollow in its comfortable and established form. His answer, when it came, was very simple and very difficult. He would walk. In 1684, at the age of 40, Bashō set out on the first of what would become a series of long journeys on foot through the provinces of Japan. He sold or gave away many of his possessions. He packed lightly. He wore simple clothes. He carried a walking staff and a pack and very little else. He traveled into regions he had never seen, along roads that were sometimes good and sometimes nearly impassable, staying in rough inns and the homes of disciples, and occasionally simply under the open sky when nothing else was available. He was not a young man by the standards of his time. He was 40, and he was often sick. He suffered throughout his life from what appears to have been a chronic digestive ailment, and the physical demands of travel often worsened it. The roads of 17th century Japan were not comfortable. There were bandits in some regions. There were difficult mountain passes and unbridged rivers. There were nights of real cold and days of real heat, and the accumulated grinding discomfort of a body that is being asked to do more than it would like. But something changed when he walked. The restlessness he had felt in the settled comfort of his Edo life found its proper channel at last. When he was moving through the world with nothing but a pack on his back and the open sky above him, and no fixed destination except the general direction of the next province, the poems came differently. They came from somewhere more honest, more immediate, less managed. There was no performance possible when you were genuinely cold, genuinely tired, genuinely uncertain, whether the next village was an hour away or 3 hours away, and whether the innkeeper would have a room or turn you away. In that state of real vulnerability, stripped of the comfortable distance that success creates, Bashō found what he had been looking for. He made several journeys in the years that followed the first one. He walked to the mountains and to the sea. He traveled into regions considered genuinely remote. He composed poems in every season and every kind of weather. He wrote about the cherry blossoms opening in spring and the mud on the road beneath them. He wrote about the elegance of an autumn moon and the fleas that had kept him awake in the inn the night before. He wrote about ancient ruins and about the feeling of arriving somewhere cold and tired and hungry and being welcomed by a stranger's fire. He held the beautiful and the difficult in the same poems, without apology, without needing to resolve the contradiction. Then came the journey that would define everything. In the spring of 1689, Bashō set out from Edo with a single companion, a devoted student and friend named Kawai Sora. They planned to travel north and then west, deep into the interior of Honshu, into the provinces of Mutsu and Dewa and beyond. into regions that even many Japanese people of the time had never visited, and that carried a certain quality of remoteness and ancient mystery. The journey they were planning would take approximately 5 months. It would cover, by the best estimates of scholars who have retraced the route, approximately 2,400 kilometers on foot, and by boat and occasional horse. Bashō was 45 years old, and his health was, as always, uncertain. He wrote, before he departed, in terms that made clear he did not know if he would return. He put his affairs in order. He sold his hut and dispersed his belongings. He said goodbye to his students and his friends, with the particular quality of farewell that belongs to someone who is not confident the word is temporary. He called this journey Oku no Hosomichi, the narrow road to the deep north, and it would become, in the centuries that followed, the most celebrated work of Japanese travel literature ever written, a text that has been translated into dozens of languages, studied in universities around the world, and returned to by readers of every background, with the kind of devotion usually reserved for sacred texts. Let us walk with him for a while, quietly, through the early pages of that journey. The departure was in early May by our reckoning. The cherry trees had already finished blooming, and the new green was everywhere. That particular brilliant, almost painful green of a Japanese early summer, when the leaves are still fresh and the air still carries the last traces of spring cold. Bashō and Sora walked out of the city in the early morning, before the streets were fully awake, and headed north. In his opening lines, Bashō writes of the months and years as eternal travelers, of the road itself as home. It is not a statement of philosophy exactly. It is a recognition of something he has already learned to be true in his own body, through the years of earlier journeys, that moving is not the opposite of belonging, but perhaps the truest form of it. The first days were difficult, as first days of long journeys always are. The body has not yet adapted. The pack seems heavier than expected. The distance between settlements seems longer than the map suggests. Bashō was already, in these early days, struggling with physical discomfort. The old ailment making itself known, the joints protesting the unfamiliar rhythm of continuous walking. And yet his writing from this period has a particular quality of clear attention that is almost like relief. The restlessness has found its proper form. There is nothing to manage, nothing to perform, nowhere to be except here, on this road, moving north. They passed through Nikko, where the great mausoleum of the first Tokugawa shogun stands, a place of immense official grandeur, all gilded carvings and imposing lacquered gates, and the accumulated authority of a dynasty that had brought peace to a country exhausted by a century of war. Bashō looked at it, wrote a brief poem about the green freshness of the leaves against the ornate structures, and moved on. Power and official splendor interested him less, in the end, than the moss on an old stone, the sound of water in a bamboo pipe, the precise quality of light through a cedar forest in the early morning. They walked north into Mutsu, the old name for the vast northeastern region of Honshu, what we now call the Tohoku, an area of mountains and forests and cold rivers, of deep snow in winter and brilliant summers, a region that even today retains something of the feeling of a Japan that is slightly older and slightly less hurried than the coasts and the cities. In Bashō's time, it was genuinely remote in places, and the roads were rough and the settlements sparse. they passed ancient battlefields now grown over with grass and wildflowers, places where great lords had met their ends and great armies had dissolved into the earth. They passed the ruins of estates and castles that had once been the centers of real power and were now just subtle shapes in the landscape, visible to someone who knew what to look for, invisible to someone who didn't. It was at one of these ruins, the site of the old castle town of Hiraizumi, once the magnificent seat of the Fujiwara lords who had ruled this northern province in the 12th century, with extraordinary elegance and genuine cultural ambition, that Bashō wrote one of the most celebrated poems in the Japanese language. The Fujiwara of Hiraizumi had been, for a brief period, rivals to Kyoto in cultural sophistication, building temples and gardens and accumulating art with the seriousness of people who understand that beauty is as important as power. And then they were gone, destroyed by war, dissolved by time, reduced to nothing visible. By Bashō's time, 5 centuries later, nothing remained of all that ambition and beauty except the ground itself, and the summer grass growing tall and thick and completely indifferent in the spaces where the great halls had been. Bashō stood there. He wept, his account tells us. Wept for the simple, overwhelming, entirely ordinary fact that time destroys everything, that all the effort and love and ambition of human beings eventually comes to this: grass and silence. And then, in the space that weeping made, a poem arrived. The summer grasses. All that remains of warriors' dreams. In the Japanese, Natsukusaya/Tsuamono domo ga /Yume no ato, 17 syllables. Let them settle in the room with you. There's no cleverness in them, no surprise, no trick. There's only the image, grass, summer, the place where people used to be, and the word yume, dream, and the word ato, which means remains, or the trace left by something that is no longer there. The poem does not tell you to feel sad. It does not tell you anything. It simply places you in the grass, in the summer heat, in front of the fact of what passes. And then it leaves you there. This is what Bashō had been reaching for, through all the years of study and walking and illness and practice. Not the cleverness of a witty surprise, but the quiet devastation of the obvious truth, arriving cleanly, without preparation, like cold water on the face. They continued north, following the old roads, crossing mountains and valleys, enduring the heat of summer that was building now toward its peak. Sora kept his own careful diary throughout the journey, a document of dates and distances and weather and the names of inns and the ordinary details of what they ate and who they met. This diary, which survived and was published centuries later, has been invaluable to scholars trying to reconstruct the actual route and sequence of the journey. It has also, occasionally, gently complicated the picture that Bashō's own literary account presents. Because Sora's diary reveals something interesting. Bashō sometimes rearranged the order of events in his narrative. He combined incidents that happened on different days into single scenes. He polished poems that he presents as having arrived spontaneously in specific moments. And the most famous haiku he ever wrote, perhaps the most famous haiku in the Japanese language, was not, in fact, composed on this journey at all. The frog poem was written years earlier, in Edo, at the banana tree hut. Bashō incorporated it into the narrow road, in a way that creates the impression that it emerged from the road itself, from the particular atmosphere of the journey. An old silent pond. A frog jumps into the pond. Sound of the water. Furuike ya kawazu tobikomu, mizu no oto. There are entire books written about these 17 syllables. Philosophers have meditated on them. Zen teachers have used them as koans for generations. Translators have struggled across centuries and languages to find words that don't betray them. It may not be possible to say anything useful about this poem that the poem does not already say better. There is the pond, old, existing before the poem, existing after it. There is the frog, anonymous, particular, briefly present. There is the jump, the one unrepeatable moment of action. There is the sound of the water, which is already gone, already only memory, by the time the syllables are finished. The poem is not about a frog. It is not about a pond. It is not about nature, or silence, or the Japanese aesthetic of impermanence, though all of these things pass through it. It is about the moment of attention itself, about what it feels like when the mind is fully, completely, without remainder present to what is happening. The frog jumps. You hear it. Nothing else exists, for just that one moment, except the sound. And then it's over. And that moment, that brief, complete, irreplaceable now, is what Bashō spent his whole life trying to write. Let it be here in the room with you, without explanation, the way sound is simply here, not explaining itself, not asking to be understood, simply arriving, and then fading into the quiet that follows. The journey continued. They followed the coast for a while, and then turned inland, and then turned toward the sea again. They visited the islands of Matsushima Bay, one of the places that every Japanese person of Bashō's time knew by reputation as among the most beautiful in the country. Hundreds of small pine-covered islands floating in a calm bay, each one slightly different in shape and size, each one perfectly composed, as though placed there by a hand with an impeccable sense of arrangement. Even today, Matsushima is counted among Japan's 3 great views, and on a clear day it is the kind of landscape that makes you stop in the middle of breathing. And here is something that has delighted scholars of Japanese literature for generations. Bashō, who composed poems about practically everything on this journey. About a rusty old sword at a roadside shrine, about the cry of a cuckoo heard through bamboo, about the shape of a particular mountain at dusk, apparently could not write a satisfactory poem about Matsushima. He composed several attempts and found them all, by his own judgment, insufficient. In the published account of the journey, the section that deals with Matsushima contains no original poem by Bashō himself. Instead, he includes a poem by another poet, as though delegating the task to someone whose words he trusted more than his own in that moment. He stood before one of the most celebrated landscapes in all of Japan, and felt, honestly and without self-deception, that his own words would only diminish it. There is a very particular kind of integrity in that silence. It is the integrity of a craftsman who knows the difference between what they can do and what a moment requires, and who chooses honesty over inadequacy. They climb to the mountain temple of Yamadera, also called Rishakuji, a complex of ancient halls and shrines clinging to the sheer face of a steep forested cliff in the mountains of what is now Yamagata Prefecture. The approach involves climbing hundreds of stone steps, worn smooth by many centuries of pilgrim feet, each step an act of intention, each step carrying you deeper into the forest and higher above the ordinary world. It was midsummer by the time Bashō and Sora arrived, and the heat was full and heavy, and the cicadas were singing in every tree. That dense, overwhelming, almost physical sound that fills the Japanese summer, like a warm hand pressing against the ears. At the top, finally, in the stillness that exists between the ancient stones and the clear sky above, Bashō wrote, "In the stillness, the sound of cicadas penetrates the rocks. Shizukasaya/iwa ni shimiru/semi no koe." This is a poem about paradox, about the way intense sound can deepen, rather than disturb the silence around it, about the way a single, penetrating note can open the quiet rather than close it. The cicadas are not interrupting the stillness. They are the stillness heard from a different angle. Sound and silence are the same thing, the poem suggests, when you are present enough to receive both at once. It is the kind of perception that is only available from a certain quality of attention, the kind that Bashō had been cultivating for 30 years by the time he stood on that cliff and heard those cicadas and understood something that he then had to write before it slipped away. The journey continued westward, toward the Sea of Japan. They crossed into Echigo, now Niigata Prefecture, where the coast road wound along cliff tops above the grey and white sea, the waves below and the mountains behind, and the road between them just wide enough for a man and his pack. They moved south through Etchu and into the province of Kaga, passing through what is now Kanazawa, a city renowned even then as a center of culture and refinement, a kind of smaller Kyoto in the north, where the arts were taken seriously, and where a famous poet arriving on foot would be welcomed with warmth and proper attention. Here, Bashō rested. He stayed longer than planned, recovering his health, meeting with disciples and local poets, participating in the social world of poetry that existed even in the provinces, perhaps especially in the provinces where cultural ambition had something to prove. He was famous now in a way that was impossible to ignore, not just respected within the poetry world, but genuinely known. His name recognized by people who had never met him, but who knew his poems, the way people know the songs of a season without remembering when they first heard them. After Kaga, they turned south and east, making their way through the mountains toward Ogaki in what is now Gifu Prefecture. By the time they arrived, it was early autumn. The journey that had begun in the fresh green of late spring had passed through the full heat of summer and was ending in the cooler, mellower light of September. Bashō was exhausted and ill and deeply, quietly satisfied. He had walked approximately 2,400 kilometers. He had composed some of the poems that would define him permanently in the imagination of every generation that came after. And almost immediately upon arriving in Ogaki, surrounded by welcoming students and friends and the warmth of a familiar household, he turned toward the road again. Within days, he set off in a new direction, south toward the great Shinto shrines of Ise, one of the most sacred destinations in all of Japan. He could not stop. Not because he was restless in the anxious, unsatisfied way he had been before the walking began, but because the walking had become for him the truest form of being alive. The road was not a means to an end. The road was the practice itself. There is something Bashō wrote in his various accounts of traveling that stays with you long after you put the books down. He describes the ideal attitude of the traveler as something like the attitude of a cloud. Not because clouds are carefree or because they float above difficulty, but because they do not hold on. They move through the world. across mountains and valleys and rivers and cities. And they leave no footprint. They pass through without grasping. And when the wind changes, they change with it, without resistance, without argument. He was not describing passivity. He was describing a kind of active, attentive surrender to what is actually happening, as opposed to what one wishes were happening, or fears might happen. The cloud does not argue with the direction of the wind. The cloud becomes the wind, for the duration of the crossing. In the years after the narrow road journey, Bashō continued to teach, to correspond with his large and devoted circle of students, and to think carefully about the nature of poetry and how to speak of it clearly. He refined and articulated a quality he called Karumi, lightness, which he described as the ideal toward which his later work was moving. Karumi is perhaps the most difficult of his ideas to translate without diminishing it. It is not lightness in the sense of being trivial or without substance. It is more like the lightness of something that has fully put down its burden. A poem that does not labor, does not strain against the limits of the form, does not try to demonstrate its own significance. A poem that arrives the way a leaf arrives on the surface of still water, without announcement, without effort, complete in itself, asking for nothing. He was working toward a kind of poetry that could speak of ordinary things, ordinary moments in ordinary lives, with full seriousness and full attention, without elevating them artificially or loading them with significance they didn't earn. A poem about eating rice, a poem about hearing a neighbor argue through a thin wall, a poem about the particular color of the sky on an afternoon in early winter when nothing special is happening and nothing is expected to happen. Karumi is the conviction that these ordinary moments are already as significant as anything else, if you can look at them with sufficient honesty. Nothing needs to be made extraordinary. Everything already is, if you can see it clearly enough. And Bashō, in his later years, was also occasionally funny. This tends to get lost in the reverent atmosphere that surrounds his name and his legacy, but it is genuinely true. He had a warm, gentle sense of humor that appears in his letters and in some of his prose, and it appears in poems that are not among his most famous, but are among his most human. He wrote about being unable to sleep because of the heat and the noise of the summer insects. He wrote about getting lost in a city and arriving at the wrong house, and the embarrassment of the explanation. He wrote about the particular and somewhat undignified misery of traveling with a bad cold through mountain country in the rain. He had a relationship with the absurdity of embodied existence that was not separate from his philosophy, but was, in some ways, essential to it. The ability to take human frailty seriously, while also finding it gently funny, is a sign of a person who has genuinely made peace with the fact of being human, who has stopped expecting the body and the world to cooperate with the life one had imagined. His students remembered him as a warm and demanding teacher, someone who inspired genuine devotion, but was not above pointing out when a poem was lazy or self-satisfied or trying too hard. He could be exacting. He had high standards, and he held his students to them because he believed they were capable of meeting them. But there was no cruelty in his teaching, no need to diminish others in order to maintain his own position. He wanted his students to find their own path toward the same quality of honesty and attention that he had spent his life reaching for. He said in one of his most quoted statements, "Do not follow in the footsteps of the ancients. Seek what the ancients sought. In other words, do not imitate the great poets. Do not try to write like the masters who came before you. Seek the same thing they were seeking: direct, honest, unmediated contact with the actual world. And you will write something that is genuinely yours, rooted in your own particular and unrepeatable life. And woven through all of this, through the philosophy of makoto and fueki ryuko and Karumi, through the long walks and the rough inns and the careful poems, was a sensibility that we now call wabi-sabi, though Bashō himself used those words carefully and sparingly. Wabi refers to a kind of beauty that is found in imperfection, in incompleteness, in the rough and the humble, and the unexpectedly moving quality of things that are not trying to be beautiful. The cracked glaze on an old tea bowl, the weathered grey of an unpainted wooden gate, the single weed growing in the corner of a stone courtyard where no weed was intended. Sabi is related but slightly different. It is the beauty of age, of things that have been worn smooth by time and use, that carry in their surfaces the evidence of all the years they have existed. The patina on old bronze, the moss on a stone lantern, the particular quality of a voice that has been singing for 60 years. These are not concepts that Bashō invented. They had been developing in Japanese aesthetics for centuries, running through the tea ceremony and the no theatre and the design of traditional gardens. But Bashō made them available to everyone, not just to specialists in court aesthetics or the tea ceremony world. He made them available to anyone who could read a poem, or hear one, or simply stand in a field in late autumn and notice the quality of the light on the dead grass. He democratized a way of seeing. He said, in effect, you don't need to be an aristocrat or a temple monk to understand that the broken and the weathered and the old can be more beautiful than the new and the perfect and the complete. You only need to look with sufficient patience and insufficient expectation. There is a poem from his later years, simple, brief, entirely characteristic, in which he describes the sound of a woodpecker knocking at a post. That's all. The woodpecker. The post. The sound in the autumn day. And yet, in the way he holds those three things together, something opens up around them. A quality of attention, of solitude, of the specific texture of a particular afternoon in a particular season that no one else will ever experience in exactly the same way again. This is wabi-sabi in its purest form, not a decoration applied to experience, but a way of receiving it. An openness to the beauty of the unremarkable, the incomplete, the passing. Among his circle of students and associates, a few figures stand out as particularly close. Kikaku was perhaps the most brilliant, a genuinely talented poet who sometimes chose cleverness over sincerity in ways that frustrated his teacher, who saw the gift and wanted it used more honestly. Kyorai was steadier and deeply devoted, and played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting Bashō's teachings after his death. Ransetsu brought a lyrical gentleness to the tradition. And then there was the remarkable lineage that continued through the generations, eventually producing Yosabu-son in the next century. A painter-poet who took everything Bashō had laid down and built something extraordinary and luminous on that foundation. And after Busen came Kobayashi Isa, whose poems are full of tenderness for small vulnerable things, frogs and flies and dewdrops, and the children of the poor. A tenderness that owes something essential to the example Bashō set of looking at the world with full attention and full care. The river of influence runs long, and it runs clear. By 1694, Bashō was 50 years old, and his health had declined in ways that could no longer be managed simply by resting and continuing. That spring and summer, he made what would be his final journey, traveling from Edo to the Kansai region, to Kyoto and Nara, and eventually to Osaka, visiting students and friends and sacred places along the way, composing poems, spending evenings in the homes of disciples who received him with the reverence due to a man who had become, during his own lifetime, something very close to a living legend. In Osaka, in the autumn of 1694, he fell seriously ill. The illness worsened despite the care of his students, who gathered from various provinces when word of his condition spread, crossing the country to be with him in whatever time remained. They sat with him through the days and nights, reading to him, composing poems in his presence, keeping the practice alive in the room where its great teacher was fading. It is worth pausing here for a moment. In the room where Bashō lay ill in Osaka, and simply noticing what his life had been. He had walked thousands of kilometers on roads that were difficult and often dangerous. He had slept in rough inns and under open skies. He had suffered illness more times than he could count, and had continued traveling anyway, because the alternative, the comfortable, settled, socially respectable life, had felt to him like a kind of slow dying of a different sort. He had given away possessions, refused comfort, chosen difficulty. And he had done all of this not out of self-punishment, not out of any asceticism that despised the body or the world, but out of a conviction that the only way to see clearly was to remain in motion, to keep exposing himself to the actual texture of existence, rather than retreating into the managed version of it that comfort makes possible. He had also loved. He had loved his students with the exacting, demanding, genuine love of a teacher who believes in what they are teaching and in the people they are teaching it to. He had loved the road itself, in the way a person loves something that has both served and damaged them, that has given them their truest experiences and cost them their health. He had loved the small things, the sound of a frog, the cry of a cuckoo, the quality of moonlight on a bay, with a fidelity that most people reserve for other people. And in some sense, the small things had loved him back, had revealed themselves to him with the particular generosity they reserve for those who approach them without agenda. In his last days, in the lucid intervals between fever and sleep, he composed what would be recognized as his death poem, a poem offered at the threshold of dying, in the old Japanese tradition that understood death as a final opportunity for distillation, a last crystallization of a life into 17 syllables, falling sick on a journey. Yet over the withered fields, my dreams continue to wander. Tabi ni ande yume wa kare no wo kakemeguru. There is so much that is entirely, essentially Bashō in those words. The journey unfinished. The body surrendering at last to what it has endured for so many thousands of kilometers of road. And the dreams, the dreaming mind that cannot stop, even now, wandering out over the withered winter fields, still curious, still moving, still somewhere between here and the next province, between this moment and whatever comes after. The body can go no further. The dreams are still walking. He died surrounded by students who had crossed the country to be with him. He was buried, in accordance with his wishes, at the temple called Gichuji, on the shores of Lake Biwa, near the city of Otsu, a place of extraordinary large beauty, where the great lake stretches wide and silver in every direction, and the mountains ring the horizon, and the seasons move through with a particular unhurried clarity. His grave is still there in the temple garden under old trees. People still come to visit it 330 years later. They bring flowers and incense. They stand quietly in front of the stone. Sometimes they bring a new poem, composed in the old way. 17 syllables pressed together like light through a paper screen, offered to the man who taught them how. The world that came after him was changed by what he had done, even if the change was quiet and difficult to measure in any direct way. Haiku, as a literary form, existed before Bashō, but haiku as a way of seeing, haiku as a meditative discipline, haiku as the compressed and exact record of a single moment of complete awareness. This is largely his creation. He transformed a literary game into something that could hold the weight of a human life without collapsing it into entertainment or sentiment. When Western writers and artists first began to encounter Japanese poetry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, through translations, through travel, through the new networks of cultural exchange that opened as Japan entered the modern world, they found in haiku something they recognized as related to what they had been reaching for, without quite knowing what to call it. The Imagist poets, working in England and America in the early decades of the 20th century, were electrified by the principles underlying Bashō's practice. The direct image, the concrete particular detail, the refusal of abstraction and explanation. The faith that if you get the thing exactly right, the thing itself, not what it symbolizes or represents or makes you think of, the emotional and philosophical weight will follow without being named. Today, haiku is written in nearly every language on Earth. There are haiku societies on every inhabited continent. There are haiku written about traffic jams and smartphones, and the particular quality of fluorescent light in a waiting room at 2 in the afternoon. There are haiku written by children who have never heard of Bashō, and by scholars who have spent their careers studying him, and by people who encountered the form by accident in a translation they picked up in a second-hand bookshop, and felt reading it that something they had always vaguely sensed was true had suddenly been confirmed. The form has adapted and stretched and transformed in ways that Bashō could not have imagined. But the essential gesture remains, at the heart of every genuine attempt. Stop here. Be still. Notice this one thing. Let it be exactly what it is, not what you want it to be, or what it reminds you of, or what it might mean. Look at it until it shows you itself. And then, as quietly as possible, write what you saw. It is worth considering what it means that this form, this Japanese form, born in the 17th century, refined by a man who was often sick and often walking and often cold and never entirely comfortable, has found its way into so many lives in so many different parts of the world. It suggests something about a hunger that is apparently universal. The hunger to be actually present in one's own experience, rather than perpetually passing through it on the way to something else. The hunger for a moment of genuine attention in a world that seems designed to prevent it. The hunger to say, this small thing, this unremarkable particular thing, is enough. It is in fact more than enough. It is everything. Bashō could not have imagined the world his poems would eventually travel through. He could not have imagined the languages they would be translated into, the schools and universities where they would be studied, the quiet rooms in distant countries where someone might lie in the dark, listening to rain on a roof that is very far from Japan, and hear the sound of a frog entering a pond, and feel, for just a moment, completely present in their own life. He could not have imagined any of this, but perhaps he would not have been surprised either, because what he was reaching for was never Japanese, never 17th century, never literary in the narrow sense. He was reaching for attention, for the quality of being genuinely, fully, without remainder awake to what is actually here, in front of you, in this exact moment, before the thinking mind turns it into something else. He was teaching people how to stop. Just stop. Just for the space of a breath. Just for 17 syllables. And let the world be the world. He was teaching people that the frog, the pond, the sound of water, that all of it is already complete, already entire, already more than enough, if only you can arrive at it without an agenda. If only you can be here, in the way that the rain is simply here, without needing the rain to mean anything more than rain. Without needing this moment to be different from what it is, or this life to be something other than the one you are living. There is a particular gift in that teaching. Not a gift of consolation, not the kind of comfort that tells you things will get better, or that suffering has meaning, or that you will be rewarded for your patience. It is a more difficult and more honest gift than that. It is the gift of permission. Permission to stop reaching past this moment toward the next one. To stop treating the present as a corridor between where you were and where you want to be, and instead to simply rest here, in this, in the ordinary, extraordinary fact of being alive in a world full of frogs and ponds and rain and grass that grows over everything we leave behind. The summer grass grows quietly over everything that once seemed so permanent and so important and so much like it would last forever. The pond is old and still, and somewhere far away and long ago, a man sets his brush down carefully on the edge of the writing desk, beside the window where the rain is beginning to fall in the garden, and listens to the silence that is also the sound of rain, and is still. And you are here, in the quiet, in the stillness between one breath and the next. Now please sit back and enjoy the gentle sounds of nature